Election 2022 is probably the most important event today for us Filipinos. So today, in this episode, we will take you to a better understanding of what Overseas Voting Act is all about.
We are referring to the law that was passed in 2004 where our migrant workers are able to participate in the elections even if they are overseas during election times.
It is just so sad that before our OFWs cannot cast their votes and able to choose our country's leaders. But in 2004, they will be able to cast their votes. Thank you for this, and it is just but right because they have contributed to our country's economy.
That is so true. So that's why the Philippine Association of Service Exporters, Inc., or PASE, is taking efforts in educating our viewers, our dear OFWs, on what they should know, understand, and do come Election Day. My name is Richard Bonifacio.
Listen in to our comprehensive interview with our guest. I am Kay Quintos.
And this is Joanne Zozobrado, and this is the show that puts premium to our modern day heroes. This is Dayo, Buhay OFW, OFW Choice Matters.
The
PASE Election Forum.
Mahaba-habang kwentuhan ito, so let's get straight to the heart of the conversation.
To give us an extensive discussion about National Election 2022, which we'll be discussing particularly on the overseas absentee voting, please welcome from the Office of Overseas Voting of the National Commission on Elections, Director Sonia Bea V. Losada.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us today. So let's start with the basics covered by the Republic Act 9189, otherwise known as the Overseas Absentee Voting Act of 2003. I think Director Lozada will be flashing her presentation.
Okay, this is just a brief overview that I put together for our overseas voting public, no? So specifically target for our overseas voters. Earlier mentioned by one of the hosts, the law or the governing law that covers overseas voting is indeed RA 9189, but that law has already been amended in 2013 by Republic Act number 10590, which is kaya po natanggal yung overseas at naging overseas voters na lang siya. So it's now known as the Overseas Voting Act of 2013. So just a brief, I'll just skip the introduction for myself. Before we go into how the 2022 national elections overseas will be conducted, let me just give an overview of how many voters we have for the 2022. So initially, as you can see, the blue bar, the dark blue bar represents the number of overseas voters that we've had from 2010 onwards. And if you compare 2019 to 2022, there was a dip from 1.822 million na ang voters natin sa 2019, but this was reduced or decreased to 1.697 million na lang for 2022. Now, there are two main reasons for this. One is we had to deactivate over 576 voter records for the 2022 because marami po hindi bumoboto noong 2016 and 2019. Kaya po bumaba yung bilang din ng botante for 2022. Another reason is the repatriation also of overseas Filipinos due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So going to the 2022 elections, there are 4 key points that we need to take note of. One is the 30-day overseas voting period, which is a 30-day period starting April 10. That's a Sunday. And it usually begins at 8 a.m. of the host country time. So kung saan parte ng mundo, ang 8 a.m. start would be 8 a.m. local time where the overseas voter is located. And then it would close at the same time as the closing of polls here in the Philippines, which is at 7 p.m. Philippine time. So magsisynchronize naman yung closing of the polls with the closing of the polls here in the Philippines. So even if that means like 7 a.m. New York time or a very inconvenient hour, that's also the time that the Philippine embassy or consulate would close to refer to is outside list of overseas voters. So this is the list of voters with the names of those on the official websites of COMELEC and also on the Philippine embassies and consulates where the overseas voters are located. Then next, unlike Philippine elections, you have to remember that there are different modes of voting and different voting systems that are implemented overseas. So abroad, may option po ang mga kababayan natin to vote by mail. So that means they get their official ballot in their mailbox or delivered to their homes. They fill it out and then they send it back to the embassy by the postal service also. And then, of course, the other method is the in-person or personal voting, which is similar to how we implement elections here in the Philippines, where you show up on any time between the April 10 to May 9 voting period overseas, and you get your ballot, you fill it in, and then you submit it also on the day of your visit. So that's the in-person voting. Ang pagkakaiba lang sa overseas at saka local, they have a longer period to do that. So 30-day period, pwede nilang ischedule as per their convenience depending on their work schedule as well. Another difference between local is sa local elections here in the Philippines, we will all be using the same system, which is the automated ballot. Yung mag-shade po tayo ng ballots at i-feed po natin yun sa VCM or sa vote counting machine. But overseas, there are two types of voting systems that will be implemented. One is the automated, which is yung paggamit nga po ng VCMs, and the super long official ballot where we shade our chosen candidates. The other is the manual, which is similar to the barangay elections locally, where when we write down the name of the candidates on the blanks. I'll be showing you how those ballots look like in the next few slides. So again, postal voting, examples where postal voting will be implemented are usually in countries where the postal service is reliable. Countries like the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, to name a few. Some countries in Europe na maganda po or reliable yung postal service, overseas voters in those areas will be getting their official ballots by mail, and they should also send it back to the embassies or consulates by mail. Personal voting naman po usually happens in areas where either the postal service is not so reliable, or if the geographical location where the overseas voter are in a small area lang, like in Singapore, where accessible naman po yung embassy. Hong Kong is one of them. Macau, we also almost all of the Middle East, like in Riyadh, in Jeddah, in Doha, in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, overseas voters in those areas will have to go to the Philippine embassy or consulate there to cast their votes in person. So for more information about what mode of voting will be used for which particular country, we have a full listing on our COMELEC website. So they just have to go on to the official website, navigate through the steps indicated on this slide po. So under the overseas voting tab, hanapin lang po nila yung file na 2022 NLE specific modes of voting. And then these are the instructions naman for those who will be using postal voting. So these written instructions are actually included in every postal mailing packet. They get it they shade the ballots, tapos meron din envelope provided. They sign their name on the envelope and then they mail it back to the embassy and then it has a security seal to ensure that that seal should be intact by the time the Philippine embassy receives it. No, so parang security feature po siya na dapat walang tampering that happens from the time you drop it off at the post office until it gets to the Philippine embassy or consulate. So there's the automated edition which uses the official ballots na mahaba. There's also the manual edition where you use the ballot that looks like the one that we use for the barangay elections. No, so this is the automated ballot that I was mentioning, where we have all of the candidates already pre-listed. So there are, for everyone's information, we have 10 presidential candidates for 2022, 9 for vice president, 64 for senatorial, and then for party list, ang dami talaga, 178. So sila yung nagpapahaba ng balota. The front would be the first 3 positions, no? Yung president, vice president, and the senators. And then yung party list, sa sobrang dami po kasi nila, their list would be on the back portion of the official ballot for overseas. So we have sample ballot templates also posted on the COMELEC website. So our voters can already look up what those ballots look like for themselves, no, depending on the country. So a few tips lang sana for our kababayan. One is dapat po nila i-shade ng maigi yung below, yung circle that's on the left side of the candidate's name, and then they have to use a ballpoint pen, a black ball pen or a marker. It has to be black because based on our 2019 experience, merong pong mga kababayan gumamit ng pink na highlighter or orange na highlighter, and the light colors will not be the VCMs won't be able to read those marks, no, if it's not a dark color like in black. And then due to, of course, budget considerations, hindi din po namin kaya na makapag-include din ng isang marker pen in each of the postal mailing packet. So voters voting by mail will have to use the ball pen that they have at home. And then, of course, the timing marks, which are the black marks on the side of the ballots, dapat hindi po siya nasa smudge. That is important for the VCM to read the ballot correctly. And it's also important for voters to keep track of the number of candidates that they are selecting. No? So dapat isa lang for president, isa lang for vice president, and not more than 12 for senators. Kasi if they overvote for the positions, meaning voting more than what is required, hindi po mabibilang yung boto nila for that particular position. Okay? So this is what the manual ballot looks like. As you can see, there are blanks corresponding to each of the positions. So voters will have to handwrite their chosen candidates into the space provided. Ang important po dito is dapat malinaw po yung sulat nila. Hindi po dapat sulat doktor. That would make it hard for our Special Board of Election Inspectors to interpret, no, yung kanilang handwriting. So important for them to write clearly and then write the complete name, especially common first names, lalo na sa candidates or sa senatorial, you have to vote for more than one position. So for the 12, it's important that you write the complete name po ng voter. I mean ng candidate, no, for each of the positions so that it gets counted correctly as well. And only one for party list. And then again, use permanent ink pens, don't use pencils, and also do not use erasable ink pens to write down the candidates, no, para permanent at hindi siya mabubura. And then as much as possible, it's important also to fill up until the 12. And if hindi po mabubuo yung 12, the voter can just close out the remaining, no, para wala nang madagdagan later on. Para din peace of mind, no, kung 10 lang talaga yung iboboto niyang senators. Then lastly, we also want to urge all overseas voters to vote early, no? They have 30 days, so please do not leave it to the last day to vote. Naging experience po natin kasi nung registration, as if you can see this table na dinudumog po talaga yung embassy or consulate on when they know that it's like almost the deadline. And that will pose a safety risk, especially in countries that are still having a high number of COVID cases. No, baka magkakaroon ng restrictions on mass gatherings, or baka din po the host countries will be alerted kung bakit nagkukumpulan sa labas ng embassy or consulate. So maximize the use of the 30-day voting period and schedule the visit as early as possible so you don't put off everything and rush to the embassy on the last day, no, or on May 9th. So for our official COMELEC platforms, alam naman natin na during this age of fake news and disinformation or misinformation, it's important also for overseas Filipinos to know that we have verified and official COMELEC Facebook accounts. In fact, for COMELEC, we have two. Just look for the blue check mark for the main COMELEC page that is for nationwide and that covers also the announcement on the local, the Philippine elections. It's comelec.ph, so fb.com/comelec.ph, and then for overseas voting is overseas voting PH. So may blue check, verified check mark naman po on Facebook, so that's how you know that that's the legitimate and official po na Facebook pages of the COMELEC and of the OFO. We also have contact information where overseas voters can reach out to us. We have a special email address for overseas voters. It's called ov.concerns@comelec.gov.ph. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you for this time that you have allotted for me on your program. Thank you.
And those were just the basics. Up next, we will be discussing the nitty-gritty when Dayo OFW, OFW Choice Matters returns.
You know what, Kay, Joanne? The presentation of Director Bea is very comprehensive.
Correct.
Parang pakiramdam ko naubusan na tayo ng pwedeng itanong eh. Director Bea, pwede ho bang, since na-cover nyo naman na ho lahat ng dapat intindihin, no, sa pagsulong ng tamang boto sa takdang panahon, pwede ba kaming magtanong ng nanggagaling naman sa ground? Ibig sabihin, you know, the usual questions that we hear from our kapwa Pilipino. And just to give context, no, to what we've covered so far. And I'll start. I hope you don't mind.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I would put myself in the shoes of our OFW abroad. And likely that my place of work will be in the same location, no? And then I'll be called to go to a place where I should cast my vote. Now, what happens if I miss the schedule? Or for some reason, my employer said, I cannot let you go because you have something important to attend to. And totally, I miss that schedule. Ano ho ba ang ibig sabihin nito? Will I still have the privilege come next election to cast my vote? Or is there anything that procedurally we have to take note of before we can do so?
First, I think it's important, to find out where exactly what the specific situation is for that overseas voter. Like if that voter is in, let's say, in America, and they get posted to a different city or a different location within the United States for the 30-day voting period, madali lang naman yung solution kasi yung balota would still be mailed to the residence of that person, and then perhaps the family members can make arrangements na lang, no, to forward the mail further, and then the voter would still be able to cast his or her vote kasi postal voting naman in North America. Now, the difficult part would be if the overseas voter is registered in a country where ang option niya lang talaga, or the method that is available to him or her is in-person voting, and then ma-assign siya sa labas, no, or outside the country where he or she is listed. So yun yung medyo we're still working out the solution for that, but for now our policy is that where you are registered, so if you're listed in, let's say, in Singapore, and you won't be there for the entirety of the voting period from April 10 to April 9, wala talagang option for now. But we're exploring other solutions wherein they'll be able to vote at the nearest embassy or consulate kung saan siya ma-assign. But the important thing is that voter would need to be in the active overseas voters list regardless of location. Dapat registered voter talaga siya to begin with. So that's still a policy in development. So if there is an update that would allow them to vote anywhere, we would also share it with you.
Thank you, Director Bea. At least if it's any consolation, wala tayong flying voter.
Correct.
Yun kasi talaga yung iniingatan natin sa overseas voters because the voting period is so long. It's 30 days, no? So the flying voter scenario is very real, no? So if they're allowed to vote anywhere, yun din yung danger na dito ka boboto tapos kung pwede pala vote anywhere, they'll just go. So there is some coordination involved for us to be able to implement a vote anywhere system. So that's still being crafted right now, and if ina-allow siya, there will of course be safeguards to prevent the flying voter phenomenon that you just mentioned.
Thank you.
All right, Director Bea, you mentioned about postal voting earlier, right? But what about, like, I am not in that place where I registered. So is there a link that I can, cast my vote in the internet or online?
At present, there is still no option to do online or internet voting. No? That's specifically because our law, the Overseas Voting Act of 2013, is very specific in the sense na dalawang method lang talaga ang nakalagay sa batas, which is voting by mail or voting in person. So, of course, this was crafted before we ever thought about a worldwide pandemic like COVID ever happening. So for internet voting kasi, for that to be a reality, there has to be an enabling law. So dapat po ipasa ng Kongreso authorizing the use of internet-based technologies for overseas voting para po maging authorized mode of voting na rin po siya.
I see.
Okay, Director Bea, you mentioned earlier that there's a sort of like a 30-day period for overseas voting. How do you can you explain to us kung saan, where will the ballots be kept within that period, and sa tingin mo ba how do we prevent tampering of the votes, whether it's by personal voting or by mail, kasi ang haba nung period, diba? There's so much room to like tamper it.
So all of our official ballots and our BCM equipment are stored at the Philippine consulate or embassy. Alam naman natin that the security in our foreign service establishments abroad are very strict, no? So that's where they are kept. And then of course, to avoid tampering or any concerns that it will be shaded, meron din naman tayong proseso, or we have transparency measures as well, wherein accredited poll watchers will be able to visit and also look. No? There is a process called the final testing and sealing of the VCMs, which will be done between March 28 and April 3. So this is a sort of a transparency measure event wherein we post the Philippine Embassy should be inviting members of the Filipino community to sort of witness, no, na the ballots the VCMs as they are being opened, na wala po siyang data loaded. So they will do test voting to see if tama yung calibration ng machine, and then they will then proceed to re-zero it or to sort of reset it para po in time for the start of the official voting period, which is on April 10th. So there should be like an observation process for it so that our overseas voters will be assured that zero po talaga, and that there's no preloaded data, so to speak, in the VCMs. So there is that re-zeroing and final testing and sealing procedure that all our overseas Filipinos community should take a part of, no, and also check with their embassy kung kailan yung schedule na yon.
Thank you for that information, Director.
All right, for those OFWs who are expecting for their ballots to be, to be mailed via postal, is there a number where they could call to follow up in case the ballots will not arrive?
So each of the Philippine embassies and consulates, meron po silang set of instructions, no, specifically to address the case. Madalas kasi for our OFWs, when they register, especially kung hindi pa nila sure, especially when they were still here at the time of registration, expecting to be deployed, upon arrival at the foreign country where they're supposed to work, sometimes they don't check in with the embassy kung saan sila naka-reside, no? So we do have quite a few instances wherein hindi talaga umaabot yung balota to the overseas voter because he or she did not update his or her address when they arrived at the country, no? So the embassy and the consulate will be posting a list of voters with no addresses. That's how you will know. Kung nakita mo yung list, pangalan mo sa listahan na yon, or you would know na ay baka kailangan ko i-report yung address ko sa kanila. And that's when the embassy or the consulate will then send out your ballot to your correct address. So they will be posting that information as soon as they get the ballots. Actually, in some of the posts, naka-receive na po sila, no? Kasi we're already in the midst of deployment to ensure that all the ballots will be at the Philippine embassies and consulates worldwide on or before March 28, actually yung target natin.
All right, Director Bea, we also have a question here. Paano yung OFW na paalis pa lang abroad? Can they still register and vote?
Thank you for that question. We get that question actually a lot, no? Especially for 2022, being a presidential election, mataas yung interest ng mga botante to cast their votes. Unfortunately, dahil yung registration period natin ay nag-end na po noong October 2021, those who are not registered will not be able to vote. Kasi as of this time, nakapost at nakapublish na nga po yung certified list of overseas voters natin. So if they're not on the list, they won't be able to vote. Yun lang po yung limitation, no? The reason why we had to do registration early and to close it early as well is we are mandated din kasi by law to print the exact number of official ballots corresponding to the registered voters. So that takes time, no? From closing, tapos kailangan po i-hearing yon para i-approve yung mga registration nila, and then finalizing the numbers, the quantities, and then also going on to printing, and then ipapackage for deployment. So it's a lengthy process. That's also why we have to close registration early to comply with our obligations under the law.
I have one last question, Director Bea. Paano pala yung canvassing of the votes? When will it happen? Hindi siya kasabay ba siya ng Philippine canvassing also?
It will happen at the same time actually as when the Philippines will also be conducting its canvassing. If you recall earlier, I mentioned na yung closing of the polls on May 9, kahit saan man sila sa mundo, is synchronized, no, with Philippine time at 7 p.m. It's precisely for that reason. We close at the same time, including overseas, synchronized po yung time para yung canvassing po will happen soon after the closing of the polls.
Director Bea, may pahabol lang pong tanong sa aming presidente sa Pasay at incidentally the president of Peridot. So no other than Ms. Raquel Bracero.
Okay, good afternoon, Director Bea. Good afternoon sa lahat ng mga nanonood. May tanong po ako, Director, after ko pinapanood yung inyong presentation, ang dami kong nakitang kumbaga ang dami kong natutunan. So isa po ay alam natin na nasa pandemic po tayo, especially last year, na ang dami pong umuwi ng mga OFWs. So ano po, ilang percentage po ang tinitingnan nyo ngayon na boboto dito sa halalan na ito?
50% hindi na active bumoboto. So in a way, parang na-cleanse na rin po yung listahan. So hopefully, with that cleansing of the list or updating of the list to reflect only those who are active, also at the same time, we implemented during the last registration cycle yung tawag nating AFIS, which is the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, wherein we are able to identify duplicate records based on the fingerprints submitted. So marami din po na bawasan na duplicate.
Maraming salamat po, Director Bea, doon sa sagot. At malaking tulong po iyon para malalaman namin kung anong expectations na kung ilan ang boboto. Now, doon naman po sa tanong na nung umuwi sila, ang dami pong siguro nag-change ba sila ng kung nagparehistro ba sila dito o hindi na nagparehistro o anong inaantay nila. So ito ba ay na-capture ito?
So actually, ma'am, out of the reported na hundreds of thousands that came home na repatriate, the actual figures po, the actual na yung mga nagpa-transfer po from, let's say, from abroad to local, it's actually very low. Nasa 20 plus lang po. 20 plus thousand voters lang po ang nagpalipat ng, ang record nila from overseas to local. Precisely because they were holding out hope na if the COVID situation turns out for the better, they may still be able to go back to where they were previously employed.
Okay, maraming salamat po, Director Bea, dun sa sagot nyo. At malaking tulong po itong ginawa nyo na pag-present ng kung ano ba itong absentee voting or na iba na yata yung pangalan niya, pero still it's an absentee voting or overseas voting. Thank you very much po, Director Bea.
Thank you so much, Ms. Raquel Bracero, Pasay President, for joining us today and for asking that very relevant and important question. Thank you.
Thank you, Pasay. Thank you, everyone.
All right, so may we get your final message, Director Bea?
Okay, to our overseas voters, again, please, in addition to following our health and safety protocols of wearing masks and bringing your hand sanitizers and bringing your own pens, to also to expedite your voting experience, because yun naman po talaga yung sa COVID pandemic natin, we have to manage crowds, we have to ensure that we don't stay in a crowded place too long. So maging handa po tayo, especially for voters who will be voting in person at Philippine embassies. Handa in the sense that we have our safety, we follow our safety protocols, we have our own ball pen, we have our identification documents ready, and also our código. We should know already going into the polling center who we're voting for at hindi dun ka mag-iisip, because that would take you longer, of course, to fill out your ballot and also to cast your vote. So be ready, vote safe, and also vote ready na alam nyo na po kung sino yung iboboto nyo on the day of your visit during the 30-day period. Yun lang po.
Thank you very much, Director Bea Lozada, for joining us today. And I hope all of you guys took notes, important notes, to remember when you are casting your votes internationally or overseas. We will be right back. This is Dayo Buhay OFW. OFW choice matters.
So to our overseas absentee voters, it's going to be a full month from April 10 to May 9 of 2022. So please go out, cast your votes, and do your duty. This is Joanne Zozobrado.
And this is Richard Bonifacio saying to remember, it is our solemn duty as Filipino citizens to go out and vote, and our duty to our fellow men and to our children to vote with our hearts.
Voting is our duty, it's our right, and it's a testament of our concern for our country. So please go to your embassies or consulate offices and vote. I am Kay Quintos.
Join us again as we discuss important issues closest to the minds and lives of our migrant workers.
This is Dayo OFW.
OFW choice matters. The
Pasay Election Forum.